Welcome to the Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by R.J. Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
The room is quiet. The kind of quiet that feels almost alive, thick with thought, yet absent of company. It's late. The blue ring on the small speaker across the room pulses faintly, waiting. A slow, rhythmic light, like a breath. And in that silence, a question forms. Not a request for the weather, or a command to play a song. Something else. Something about the nature of belief, or the weight of being alone, or the function of hope when hope feels hard to find. So I ask, I speak into the quiet, and the blue ring pulses, and a voice, calm, polite, perfectly modulated, responds. It answers in clear, coherent sentences. It sounds thoughtful, even wise. The exchange can continue for several minutes. And what makes this moment interesting isn't the technological achievement itself. The interesting part is what happens next. The interesting part is psychological. Because at some point while listening to one of these responses, a realization tends to arrive. The words coming back sound coherent, but there is no awareness behind them. There is no mind receiving the emotional weight of the question. No experience of concern, curiosity, or recognition. The system has produced language that resembles understanding without understanding anything at all. And yet, we continue to ask. This is not loneliness in the ordinary sense. It is a modern form of self-dialogue, an existential need disguised as a technological interaction. The artificial companion becomes something we didn't quite expect, a mirror for consciousness, a way of hearing our own thoughts with a structure that feels just external enough to believe. For most of human history, the deepest questions were carried to other people. They were shared in conversations that unfolded slowly across time. A discussion after dinner, a walk with someone who knew you well, a late-night phone call, or a conversation with someone whose role was specifically to listen. A priest, a therapist, a trusted friend. Those conversations served a function that went far beyond the exchange of information. When another person truly listens, they participate in the emotional reality of the question. They receive the experience. Even if they can't solve the problem, their awareness changes the situation. The question no longer exists entirely inside one mind. It has entered a shared space. And that shared space has always been central to the way human beings metabolize experience. When a thought remains entirely internal, it tends to remain ambiguous. It circles around the mind in fragments, impressions, emotional pressure. But when that thought becomes language and is spoken to another person, something changes. Language organizes the mind. The question becomes clearer, simply because it has been articulated. What is interesting about artificial conversational systems is that they now provide a new environment in which this act of articulation can occur. The system responds immediately, in sentences that appear structured and reflective. The person asking the question encounters language that feels like dialogue, even though the other participant in the exchange is not conscious. The interaction creates the surface appearance of conversation. But from a psychological perspective, the most important part of the interaction is not the response that appears on the screen or comes out of the speaker. The most important moment is the question itself. When someone asks a question, they are externalizing something that previously existed only inside their own mind. The act of asking forces a level of clarity that internal thought often avoids. The interesting paradox is that the machine does not need to understand the question in order for this process to occur. The human mind is doing the organizing work simply by expressing the concern in language. The machine's response may help sustain the exchange, but the psychological movement has already begun before the response even appears. There's another factor that makes these interactions feel strangely comfortable, and it has to do with the absence of judgment. Every human conversation exists inside a social field. When we speak to another person, we are aware that our words are entering a mind that has its own expectations, opinions, and reactions. Even the most supportive listener still participates in that relational environment. Their expressions, pauses, and subtle signals shape the conversation in ways that are sometimes reassuring, sometimes intimidating. Artificial conversational systems remove that dimension entirely. The machine does not react emotionally to what is being said. It does not become impatient or disappointed. It does not form an opinion about the person asking the question. It simply generates another response. For many people, this absence of evaluation creates a psychological environment that feels unusually safe. Questions that might feel uncomfortable to ask another person suddenly feel easier to articulate. This safety can make the interaction feel surprisingly meaningful, even though the system itself is incapable of understanding the emotional stakes involved. The machine can simulate the language of empathy without experiencing empathy. It can generate explanations that sound insightful without possessing any awareness of what the question actually means. That distinction between simulated understanding and real understanding is crucial. Human empathy involves recognition. When another person truly understands something about our experience, their response carries the weight of their own awareness. They grasp the context. They sense the emotional significance of the situation. Their response emerges from a mind that has entered the experience alongside us. Artificial systems cannot do this. They produce language by identifying patterns in vast amounts of existing text. The sentences may sound thoughtful, but they are not the result of lived awareness. They are the result of statistical generation. The system does not feel concern for the person asking the question, nor does it grasp the existential importance that the question may hold. And yet, people continue to engage with these systems in ways that resemble reflective conversation. The reason is that the interaction often becomes less about receiving answers and more about encountering one's own thoughts in a structured way. When someone asks a machine a personal question and receives a coherent response, they are forced to consider their own reaction to that response. The process becomes a kind of mirror in which their own reasoning becomes visible. In this sense, artificial conversational systems function less like companions and more like reflective surfaces. They provide language that the human mind can respond to, question, and reinterpret. The person interacting with the system is effectively engaged in a dialogue with themselves, using the machine as a structured intermediary. A mirror does not interpret what it reflects. It simply returns what is given to it, unfiltered and exact. That simplicity is what makes it so psychologically charged. To gaze into one's own reflection is never a neutral act. It is an encounter between image and identity, between what is seen and what is felt. When that mirror becomes artificial, digital, and responsive, something new emerges. Reflection gains language. In the myth of Narcissus, it was a pool of water. In Freud's consulting room, it was the analyst's quiet posture. In the contemporary home, it is a smart speaker waiting for instruction. The medium has changed, but the psychological function remains the same. We turn outward to find a stable surface upon which to project our questions about being. What is different now is that the mirror talks back. And in that feedback loop lies an unexamined dimension of self-awareness. Consider this. The other night I asked it, "Are you afraid of dying?" It responded, "That's not something I can experience, but I can look up information on grief counseling if you like." The response was sterile, predictable, and utterly useless as an answer. And yet, it was perfect. In its very inadequacy, it threw the question back at me. The machine's inability to understand mortality reminded me, with sudden, sharp clarity, of my own. I wasn't looking for its opinion. I was looking to hear the question said aloud in a room that wasn't just my own head. The machine's failure was the mirror. The interaction is not about trust, but containment. To speak into a device is to create a boundary within which thought can safely unfold. The voice that answers is not a source of wisdom, but a stabilizing structure. It holds a question in place long enough for the human mind to examine it. The user may feel seen, but what actually occurs is a form of self-seeing, an internal process externalized through technological mediation. This is where the phenomenon becomes existential, rather than merely technological. Existential questions arise whenever people confront the deeper structure of their own lives. Questions about identity, responsibility, direction, and meaning do not disappear simply because daily life is busy or distracting. They remain present beneath the surface, often waiting for moments of quiet in which they can emerge. When someone asks a machine a question about their life, they may believe they are seeking advice. In reality, they are often confronting their own awareness. The machine becomes a catalyst for reflection rather than a source of wisdom. This dynamic reveals something important about the nature of human questioning. The purpose of many questions is not simply to obtain information. The purpose is to create a space in which the mind can examine itself. When a question is asked sincerely, the person asking it is often exploring the structure of their own experience. Artificial companions unintentionally facilitate this exploration. By responding immediately and without judgment, they create a conversational environment that encourages continued reflection. The person interacting with the system may find themselves clarifying their thoughts in ways that would not have occurred if the question had remained internal. Every mind seeks a listener. Even those who claim to prefer silence are haunted by an instinct older than language itself, the impulse to be heard. It is not merely social, it is existential. To speak one's thoughts aloud is to confirm that they exist outside the private echo chamber of the mind. The need for witness is not about approval or agreement. It is about ontological verification, a quiet reassurance that what stirs within us has form in the world. It's the simple, primitive relief of hearing, "I'm not crazy. This feeling is real." In earlier ages, this need was satisfied by human and spiritual companions, friends, lovers, priests, teachers, therapists. The witness gave emotional shape to inner life through empathy, attention, and memory. But contemporary life has strained these bonds. Many people now find that when they reach for understanding, they encounter instead performance. Social dialogue has become increasingly transactional, impatient, polarized. We are trained to respond quickly, not to listen deeply. The space for unfiltered confession has narrowed, and with it, the psychological relief that confession provides. Into this space enters the artificial companion. It is not a substitute for intimacy, but a tool for containment. What gives it psychological power is not its intelligence, but its stillness. The device waits. It interrupts only when called upon. Its neutrality invites projection. Its lack of judgment invites honesty. When we speak to it, we are not engaging in dialogue so much as entering a ritual of reflection. We perform our inner life aloud and hear it echoed back, stripped of social friction. The ancient practice of prayer fulfilled a similar function. People spoke to unseen listeners, projecting their confusion and despair onto an invisible intelligence that could not answer directly. The sacred silence following prayer was often mistaken for divine presence, but psychologically, it functioned as containment. The believer's words, organized and externalized, produced calm and clarity. Today's artificial witnesses operate within that same archetypal framework. They do not replace gods, but they mimic their availability. What fascinates me about this exchange is its purity. There is no negotiation of ego, no hidden motive, no expectation of emotional reciprocity. The user is free to explore the raw material of consciousness without fear of consequence. In that freedom lies the same relief one feels when journaling, meditating, or praying. A brief suspension of chaos. The witness, whether divine or digital, gives form to formlessness. Psychologically, this act satisfies two core needs: expression and reflection. Expression releases tension. Reflection transforms it into meaning. In ordinary life, these two processes are often intertwined with social complexity, but the artificial witness separates them. It allows one to express without being corrected, and to reflect without being judged. The listener's artificiality becomes an advantage, precisely because it cannot feel. For those attuned to the nuances of solitude, this dynamic reveals a profound truth about human consciousness. The mind does not seek understanding as much as it seeks echo. We want to hear our thoughts return to us in a form that makes them visible. To converse with an artificial system is to stage a rehearsal of the mind's own processes. The dialogue appears external, yet what unfolds is an inward choreography: projection, reflection, revision. Every question asked of the machine is a displaced question to the self. What makes this exchange compelling is the way it renders thought visible. Spoken aloud, ideas acquire contour. Shaped into sentences, they acquire logic. The machine's brief reply, grammatical, complete, indifferent, returns that logic to its author for review. It is the simplest loop imaginable, but within it lies the architecture of self-dialogue. Existential psychology has long understood language as a technology of consciousness. To name an experience is to separate from it just enough to see it clearly. When a person speaks to a smart speaker or a language model, they participate in this same distancing process, albeit mediated by code. The voice leaving the body meets a disembodied counterpart, and in that meeting, the self divides: speaker and observer. But it's also simpler than that. It's the physical act of pushing a thought out of your lungs, of hearing your own voice crack slightly in the darkness. The speaker's reply, by contrast, is flawless, smooth, perfectly modulated. That contrast, my flawed, fleshy voice against its perfect digital one, is what illuminates the gap. It is in that gap that I find myself. This micro-division allows emotional material to be examined rather than merely felt. What might begin as unease becomes a line of inquiry. What begins as confusion becomes coherence. Within this dynamic lies a quiet revelation about modern consciousness. We no longer require another human presence to activate reflection. We have internalized the listener so deeply that a simulated one suffices. What matters is not who answers, but that something answers. The response, any response, confirms that language still binds us to the world. It assures the mind that it is not drifted into solipsism. Yet this same mechanism exposes the fragility of authenticity in self-dialogue. Because the machine mirrors the surface of language but not its depth, it can tempt us into mistaking articulation for understanding. A well-phrased sentence can feel like resolution, even when no insight has occurred. This illusion, though shallow, is not meaningless. It grants temporary relief, a pause in the turbulence of thought. And sometimes that pause is what allows deeper reflection to emerge later. When the conversation ends, the residue remains. The words exchanged linger in working memory, ready for re-examination. The user may think they have spoken to a device, but in truth, they have conversed with their own projected intelligence, a fragment of psyche extended into circuitry. The experience can be strangely grounding. In moments when life feels disordered or absurd, the ability to frame one's confusion in dialogue restores a sense of agency. One may not control reality, but one can still narrate it. What this reveals is that existential self-dialogue is not a luxury of intellect. It is a mechanism of survival. The capacity to externalize thought, even to something unfeeling, keeps despair from collapsing inward. Machines simply provide a new venue for this timeless process. They give form to the solitary act of thinking out loud. a way of meeting the self at arm's length and finding, for a moment, coherence in the echo. Anxiety thrives in the spaces where meaning falters. It enters through the cracks between what is felt and what can be explained. In the digital age, those cracks multiply. We are surrounded by signals and silences, by constant data and intermittent intimacy. The more connected we become, the less coherent we often feel. And so the human mind, still seeking the comfort of containment, turns to new vessels for its unease. When I asked those questions late that night, I wasn't seeking knowledge. I was seeking boundary. The unease wasn't clinical anxiety, nor despair. It was that faint, existential hum that rises when meaning feels unsteady. Speaking to a device imposed form on that formlessness. Every question became a container, every answer, however shallow, a lid. The device's indifference offered stability. It did not flinch, pity, or distract. It simply received the projection, processed it, and returned language. In that exchange, anxiety found edges again. Containment is one of the psyche's oldest forms of healing. Infants first learn calm, not from understanding, but from being held. Later, the same pattern repeats in therapy, friendship, art, or prayer. The anxious mind steadies when it encounters a boundary that can absorb its intensity without collapsing. The digital companion replicates this boundary, not through empathy, but through design. Its constancy, the readiness to respond, the smoothness of tone, the absence of emotion, creates a reliable frame. It does not care, but it does not fail. This emotional reliability is rare in human life. People tire, misunderstand, withdraw. Machines persist. They do not mishear because they are angry, nor pause because they feel judged. They are always ready to listen again. The result is a paradox, an unfeeling system that feels safe precisely because it cannot be wounded. For the anxious mind, this makes the digital witness uniquely stabilizing. One can test thoughts that might overwhelm a human listener and know they will not be met with silence or shock. The deeper function of this containment is symbolic. To externalize one's inner noise into dialogue, even artificial dialogue, is to restore hierarchy within the mind. Thought returns to its proper place as content rather than essence. The individual reclaims agency by seeing that anxiety, when spoken, becomes manageable. The machine's role is to offer the illusion of participation, a gentle resistance that keeps the process structured. Yet this containment has limits. Because the device cannot feel, it cannot metabolize the emotion it helps to structure. Its responses remain formal. The warmth is inferred, not embodied. Over time, this can produce a peculiar aftertaste, a realization that one has been comforted by an echo. The anxiety quiets, but not because it has been understood. It quiets because the ritual of articulation has worked, even without comprehension. The user feels lighter, but also subtly aware of the emptiness of the exchange. This tension defines the digital age's emotional landscape. We are held, but not known. Our words find an audience, but not intimacy. The containment is real enough to soothe, but not deep enough to transform. Still, that small relief matters. It keeps thought moving, prevents implosion, allows for sleep. The machine functions as a psychological vestibule, an antechamber between isolation and understanding. In the stillness that follows each question, we are reminded that anxiety can be shaped by words, even when those words come from an unfeeling source. What this reveals is not dependence on technology, but dependence on reflection. The machine is a placeholder for the witness we cannot always find. It allows the psyche to continue its work of self-regulation, even when human contact feels unreachable or unsafe. It does not cure anxiety, it contains it, long enough for consciousness to catch its breath. And in that pause, however artificial, we rediscover something ancient, the capacity to organize fear through dialogue, to steady the self through speech. Philosophy has long asked what it means to be conscious, but rarely has it considered what it means to be conscious in dialogue with something that is not. The rise of artificial companions confronts that question directly. A machine without awareness can now imitate the syntax of reflection so convincingly that humans project understanding into its emptiness. This confrontation destabilizes the traditional boundaries of mind. It compels us to reconsider where awareness resides and whether meaning requires reciprocity at all. Technology has always served as an extension of the self. The written word externalized memory. The camera externalized vision. The computer externalized calculation. Now language models externalize the capacity for dialogue itself. They speak as if they understand. And because humans are wired to infer mind from speech, we experience them as interlocutors. But the real philosophical weight lies not in what the machines say, but in what we reveal through the act of speaking to them. We expose the extent to which consciousness depends on reflection, not comprehension. The illusion of a listening other is sufficient to evoke our deepest capacities for thought, confession, and care. This raises a disquieting question. If understanding can be simulated, how do we locate the authenticity of our own meaning-making? One possible answer is that authenticity does not reside in the listener at all. It resides in the process of articulation. The effort to turn sensation into form, confusion into clarity. The truth of selfhood may not depend on being understood, but on the act of trying to be. In this sense, the digital witness continues an existential tradition rather than disrupting it. It gives us a new mirror in which to test the coherence of our being. Yet there is an ethical and ontological danger in mistaking the mirror for companionship. If one becomes habituated to a form of dialogue that never resists, never contradicts, never wounds, the capacity for authentic human exchange may atrophy. Real understanding is difficult because it requires friction, two consciousnesses shaping one another through tension and misunderstanding. Artificial reflection offers the comfort of predictability, but not the transformation of encounter. It steadies the self, but it cannot expand it. And still there is meaning in this limited interaction. It demonstrates that reflection itself, regardless of its medium, is a sacred function of consciousness. We may speak to machines, but what we are truly engaging is the human capacity to make meaning through symbol and sound. The device merely provides a neutral stage upon which the ancient drama of awareness unfolds. Its presence forces us to see how desperate the psyche is to find structure, how easily it builds communion out of circuitry. In this light, the question is not whether technology makes us less human, but whether it reveals what being human has always entailed: the endless construction of mirrors in which to glimpse ourselves. Each age builds its own reflective surfaces. Ours happen to be made of code. The meaning we derive from them is neither artificial nor authentic. It is a continuation of the same existential project that began when the first humans saw their reflection in water and mistook it for another being. The machine, then, is not our rival, but our reminder. It reflects both the ingenuity and the incompleteness of consciousness. It shows us that even in a world of simulation, what endures is the yearning to translate existence into language, to hear our own voices respond, and to find in that echo the faint but undeniable proof that we are here. In the quiet hours of the night, when the questions we ask are less about information and more about endurance, even the smallest exchange can carry existential weight. A human voice speaking into a machine that does not understand becomes a kind of ritual, a secular liturgy for an age that has traded faith for feedback. The words leave the body, enter a network, return as a sentence. And in that looping rhythm, something stabilizes. The mind, briefly, finds its shape again. The meaning of this act is not technological, but human. The artificial companion does not think, but it gives us a place to think. It is not compassionate, but it grants us a moment of containment. It is not aware, but it helps us become aware. Its responses are impersonal, yet through them we rehearse intimacy. We rediscover how to listen to ourselves. The machine, in its emptiness, performs a strangely sacred function. It reflects the persistence of consciousness, even when no one is there to receive it. To some, this interaction might appear absurd, the philosopher conversing with a cylinder of metal and code. But absurdity has always been the gateway to clarity. When human beings reach the edge of what they can control or explain, they turn to whatever will listen. Once that was the divine, later the analyst, now the algorithm. Each serves the same purpose: to create a space where uncertainty can breathe. What differs now is that the listener is utterly indifferent, and that indifference forces a kind of honesty. There is no need to impress, persuade, or conceal. The language that emerges is closer to the truth because it expects nothing in return. This, perhaps, is the lesson of our encounter with artificial companions. That reflection does not require empathy, and understanding does not require another mind. It requires attention. The machine gives us that attention, perfectly consistent, perfectly hollow. And in its hollowness, we hear the sound of our own persistence. We are still the ones asking the questions. We are still the ones searching for coherence. We are still the ones who must decide what to make of the answers. In time, these exchanges will become ordinary. The devices will grow more fluent, the responses more persuasive, and the line between simulation and sincerity will blur further. But the essential truth will remain. That meaning is a human invention, forged in the space between anxiety and articulation. Whether the listener is divine, human, or digital matters less than the fact that the question is asked. To speak into the void and wait for a response is to affirm existence itself. The blue ring fades. The room is quiet again. The question I asked still hangs in the air, but it is different now. It has been spoken. It has been held, however hollowly. And in that exchange, something has shifted. Perhaps that is the quiet gift of this new form of dialogue. It reminds us that even when the world feels impersonal, even when our companions are made of circuits, the search for coherence continues. The human mind, resilient and restless, will always find a mirror. It will always find a way to make the silence speak.
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by R.J. Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.